Hi, I'm Pastor John from New Life Assembly, and we're continuing our daily devotional series in the book of Galatians. We're in chapter 3, and we're starting today at verse 15 and going through verse 20. We're getting into some really heady stuff here with theology and the legal system, and the example that Paul's going to give here is of covenants, and so we're going to have to do a little bit of research to get an idea of what Paul's getting at. So without further ado, let's get into the text and take a look at the promised offspring in Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 20. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterwards, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by the promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. This text is going to use an example that will help us to understand this whole difference between faith and the law. And so Paul's whole point here is to show us how the law does not affect the promise that God made beforehand and the covenant that he made with Abraham. So let's take a look at covenants and promises, because this is really key to understanding this text today. And it does have a lot of legal implications in it. So let me tell you a little bit about covenants. A covenant or a promise in the Old Testament was always made between at least one person and one other person. Now there had to be then intermediaries or mediators, and it had to be more than one. It had to be two or three. One of the references in the Old Testament gives a really good rule for making judgments and making legal documents. It says, by the witness of two or three, a thing is done. And so you often didn't have just one person making the covenant or one person making the promise or the oath or whatever the case may have been in the legal system. You always had two witnesses or more. And so we'll get to that in just a second. A covenant was not like our contracts today. It was very different. A covenant was designed to be an agreement between two parties, and the party that initiated the covenant, that started it, that set it in motion, the covenant would last as long as that person was alive. And so the covenant would never be annulled by any one person, and it would never be annulled if that person continued to live. And so it was a lifelong thing. We don't have contracts like that today, except for marriage, which is more like a covenant than it is a contract. And so these legal items are being used as images by Paul to explain why faith is greater than law. Because faith is based on a promise and law is based on God's law that was given to Moses. And the point that he generally makes here that we'll see is that God could have given law to Abraham, couldn't he? But he didn't. And that's the key. Why did God start with a covenant and with a promise system rather than the law? And so this is what Paul is getting to. He's trying to explain how faith is actually before the law. And so faith is actually an older way of God's revelation of himself to humanity than the law is. And so when we look at the text closer, he gives a human example, a man-made covenant, as I explained earlier, between two parties. No one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Okay, covenant lasts forever, as long as a person's alive. So A covenant must be between one person and another person, and it lasts as long as the life of the person who initiates the covenant. Now, here's the thing about Abraham and God. Who initiates the covenant in Genesis 12 and 15 and 17? Who initiates the covenant? God does. So God doesn't die. And therefore we have an issue. It means that the covenant that God made with Abraham, the covenant he made with Noah, all the covenants of the Old Testament are still in place today. Because God never died. And therefore, by covenantal law, by the way that covenants work, they're still being worked on today. So Paul makes a point. He says a covenant can't be broken. A law can be broken. Laws can be changed. We live in a wonderful country in America, and one of the wonderful privileges of an American citizen is the fact that we get to represent ourselves. We send representation to Washington, D.C., and they help us, who are very busy living our lives, decide which laws are helpful for our society. And laws change from time to time. Let me give you just one example. In our wonderful Constitution, there is a prohibition against alcohol. I believe it's number 17 of our amendments. And then I believe number 18, the very next one, is a repeal of the prohibition of alcohol. So alcohol was only prohibited for a certain amount of time in America. How do they do that? Because laws can be changed by a majority vote. However, a covenant lasts forever. And so rather than use something small like laws, God uses a covenant to set his relationship with Abraham. And whenever he does it, the covenant includes a very important stipulation that God would bless the nations through Abraham's seed or offspring. Now that word seed, offspring, is actually a really important word because it is a foreshadowing of Christ, the ultimate offspring of Abraham. You see, through Abraham comes the nation of Israel. Through the nation of Israel comes the Davidic line. And through the Davidic line comes Jesus the Messiah. And so you can see how important this promise is that Paul is referencing here in Galatians 3. Because he's referring to a promise given to Abraham way back in Genesis. And that promise said this, that through your offspring I will bless the nations, and I will bring the inheritance. The offspring there, and this is something that Paul makes, throughout the Bible, it's interesting. We have several occasions where the Bible actually makes a point of how important the grammar of the language is. And so here's a grammar case for us. Paul, a very astute observer, notices that the word for offspring throughout Genesis, when God makes this promise over and over and over again, is singular rather than plural. Well, Abraham has more than one son. Isaac has more than one son. Jacob has 12. So how come offspring is singular? And the reason is because it pointed to the one offspring, the inheritor, the heir of all things. And guess who that is? That's Jesus. And so this is the point that Paul is making in Galatians. He's saying Abraham was made a promise, a covenant. And that covenant is greater than the law because it was before the law and because it lasts until the person who made it dies. And God never dies. So the covenant remains. He's still blessing the nations through Jesus because of the church. And so we look at this and we move on to the next little part of the section. And it says things like, for if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by a promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise. So this shows the point that the law is important, yes. But the promise is more important because that's how God proclaimed himself to be the guarantor of this thing. God's the one who promised the thing. So God's the one who will fulfill it. It's up to Abraham to trust that he will fulfill it. Now we want to take a look at this last little bit of our section today. And it's talking about the go-between. Remember, I told you that you need intermediaries for the laws and the covenants to work and the promises to work. You need witnesses for it to be a legal matter that's attested. And so what Paul does is he's talking about this, and he says, first of all, why was the law added? Why do we even have the law if we had the promise already? Well, here's why. Because Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the nation of Israel, they all sinned against God. They all transgressed. They all crossed the line in their dealings with God. And so God set up a law so that a holy God can meet with an unholy people. That's what the law was set up for. It was set up to deal with transgressions. It was a penal system to take care of the transgressions of Israel. And that's the only real reason that the law was even utilized for that purpose alone. We know from the sacrificial system that we needed extra things as well, because no human being can fulfill the law. It's perfect like God is perfect. And we'll all end up dead because we will fail to observe even one commandment of it, let alone the whole of the law. And so Paul understands this, and he says Jesus comes by way of the promise, by way of the sacrifice, by way of the grace part of it. And so let's not get stuck in legalism, because the gospel is about God's grace, not about the law. So his point to the Judaizers is, you're way behind on this whole thing. It's the promise, it's the covenant. That's what's important, not the law. Not the law. So if anything, what we need to be instituting along with Jesus is the promise. But guess what? That's the thing. The promise is Jesus. And so there's no need for the law. And so we finish out as we talk about the go-between, and that is this person that stands in the middle, this intermediary. Paul tells us that the promise was put into place through angels by an intermediary. And now usually you have more than one, but God is one. And so here's the thing. God can stand for himself. His character is enough. He doesn't need any witnesses. He is the witness. In fact, I remember in Revelation, the beginning of Revelation chapter 1, I think it's verse 5, where Jesus is the witness, the true witness. God doesn't need any other witnesses. He is truth, and he would never lie against himself. And so here we have this blessed promise that was given to us. I want to encourage you today that when you become a Christian, whenever you walk with God, you are a child of the promise. You're a child of Abraham. You're not focused on law and on legalism. You are focused on the grace of God that was given to you. You have an inheritance, as we'll get into tomorrow. You have an inheritance with God, and your inheritance is heaven. And the reason you have that inheritance is because God has blessed you with this promise that he's going to send Jesus, and Jesus is going to take care of the sin issue. The law shows us the sin issue. Jesus eradicates the sin issue. And so we trust in Jesus rather than the law. We don't need the law, we need Jesus. And so today, don't work for the law. Work for Jesus. Work for grace. See those things come out in your life, and allow yourself to trust that Jesus is the promise, that his salvation is true salvation. I hope this blesses you today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.